Hey everybody, before we get started this week, I have huge news. She actually did it. We're pleased to announce that Beatrice Jin, top-ranked women's competitor in North America and longtime BJJ Mental Models premium community member, has published her first ever course with us, exclusive to BJJ Mental Models. It's called Stop Being Nice. It's a 3-part audio series designed to solve real mindset problems that regular folks experience in jiu-jitsu. If you struggle to be aggressive and competitive in jiu-jitsu, you'll find the solutions here. If you're already a BJJ Mental Models premium subscriber, you've already got access. And if you are not, good news, you can get it now and get your first week free. Go to bjjmentalmodels.com and check it out today. Welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 395. I am Steve Kwan, and BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And this week, it's Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ. He is back. Jesse, how are you doing, sir?
Steve, I'm great. I'm so glad to be back. I appreciate you having me on.
How is Kentucky these days? I hear you guys have ticks.
Oh, full of ticks. We're lousy with ticks. You know, some people say it's a government conspiracy. I don't know what it is, but they are everywhere.
I have heard this. I have heard that it is a government conspiracy that ticks are getting dropped from jets or something to infect the population. You know what? Out of all of the dumb conspiracies I've heard, that one entertains me the most.
It's great. The idea of just little ticks flying through the air with parachutes, I really love it.
It's so funny. Up here in Canada, it's been all over the news. There have been these alerts like, beware the American tick invasion this summer. Expect an onslaught of American ticks. So I think it's going to be a bad year for that. Anyway, everyone check your skin. Make sure you know how to be treated for those things. Make sure you know how to test them for Lyme disease if you do get bit by one. That's enough of a tick update. Why don't we get into the jiu-jitsu? Jesse, you had a topic to discuss here. Do you want to present it?
Sure, yeah, I could take a stab at it. So I wanted to talk some about the idea of tension and adding tension to a joint before you actually start the breaking mechanics of a joint lock. It's something that I have talked about for a lot of years, and it's something that I'm relatively passionate about. And a lot of times when I get in big crowds of, I just got back from Grappalachia a little while ago and, talked about it there. And, a lot of times when I talk about it, we get some blank stares. So I thought it'd be a really fun topic to present to your listeners.
Let's do it, because this is going to be relevant to, almost any time you grab someone by the arm or the leg, how you apply tension matters tremendously. And you know me, I didn't go to some fancy-dancy professor school. So if I have an excuse to talk about grade 2 or grade 3 level science and sound really smart, I'm going to take that opportunity. So let's do it. Let's talk about tension. What's the thesis that you present here, Jesse? How does this apply and how do you teach it?
So the main premise is that putting a joint, if we're using a technical term, putting a joint in traction, or when you think about like pulling one joint surface away from another, before you start the actual breaking mechanics, the joint lock will require a lot less effort and energy to actually finish. And I think that is a problem that lots of folks have, regardless of the joint that we're dealing with. A lot of times people feel like they've run out of runway and don't have any more kind of force to exert because they've given all their body can give. And I would suggest that was because they run out of runway because they didn't add enough tension into the joint before they started the breaking mechanics.
So I suppose the most obvious example here is the arm bar. I think everyone has probably had a teacher at some point explain to them that you cannot just rely on being able to stretch back and hip up to finish an arm bar, because you will run out of room, especially if you are doing it from a position where your back is on the mat. When you try to bridge into that arm bar, if your back is on the mat, there's only so much you can bridge. And that becomes a problem if the arm bar is loose. Whereas if it's tight enough, then you don't even need to bridge to your full limit in order to get the tap. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of the time when I'm demoing, when we think about that mounted arm bar where someone's laid on their back and your legs are kind of over the top of them and you're falling back onto your back with the arm, most of the time when I'm demoing that, my back doesn't even hit the mats before I get a tap out of it. And that's just speaks to how much tension I'm putting into that arm as I'm moving backwards. I'm kind of the opposite of Ronda Rousey.
Well, the common counterexample to this argument about tension is you see people in the UFC and MMA throw on these arm bars and get the tap, and they don't look particularly beautiful. Sometimes they even look kind of loose. And so people look at that and think, well, this looks quite different from what my coach at jiu-jitsu tells me is the right way to do an armbar. Why are they able to get away with this? And I think there's a few reasons. First is often it's hard to tell just by looking at an armbar how tight or how loose it is. It might look kind of funky, but it could actually be unbelievably tight. Also, in the heat of the moment, especially when strikes are involved, you're probably not going to get beautiful textbook technique. Even in jiu-jitsu, when your opponent is putting up full resistance, it's hard to make everything look beautiful and textbook. So there's always going to be some degree of compromise, but the tighter you have the armbar when you get the sequence started, the easier you're going to have a time finishing because you have more room to make those compromises if you need to. If it was already loose and lots of slack to begin with, then you don't have any wiggle room after the fact to finish it if your opponent starts putting up a good defense. Whereas if it's really tight, then even if you make some mistakes or they start loosening it a bit, it will still be tight enough to get that tap.
Yeah, that's right. And I also think, one of the big differences between, since I brought that example up, Ronda Rousey and a normal student, Rough Hands, is that Ronda is far less concerned about the safety of the person that she's doing the armbar to in that moment. I often tell people, when we go through the order of operations of a joint lock, establishing good control before we do anything is paramount. And if you don't have good control over their body, center mass, you're usually going to have to fix that by adding speed and power into your joint lock, which is, I think, what you see a lot in MMA. There's a much higher sense of urgency there, even in competitive jiu-jitsu. There's a much higher sense of urgency, so they may start attempting those braking mechanics before they've really established the kind of control that they may need to finish it cleanly.
The other thing that I often find is sometimes when you're going for an armbar, as you try to get the finish, you encounter oddities about body dynamics. So a really common example I get is if I'm doing a topside armbar and I kind of go off to the side to finish, sometimes I'm surprised by the amount of space on the far shoulder that I do or I don't have. And you hear this constant ongoing debate about should you cross your ankles or not when you're doing an armbar. My feeling has been that it depends. Your goal is to get a tight pinch and to make sure they can't rotate and hitchhiker out or bridge into you. And how you place your feet is going to depend on the body dimensions. Sometimes you don't feel that until you actually try to armbar a person. So there have been times when I've gone to cross my ankles for an armbar, and I think it's going to be the best way to do it. But then as I get into it, I realize, you know what? This actually doesn't really quite feel right. So I switch to a pinch, or maybe I go for a classic pinch, and then I realize, you know what? I got to cross my ankles on this one. And so I switch it up. And so I think maybe that's sometimes why, especially in MMA, it looks like the armbar is kind of loose because the person is actively fiddling around with how to make it as tight as possible. You don't always know just by looking how your body dimensions are going to line up with the other person when you go for a move like that.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, there are lots of times where you may be attempting some sort of joint lock and you may have to go back and kind of unscrew it up. You may need to go back and get a tighter clamp or control it in a particular direction, right? A lot of times control of that joint doesn't necessarily mean 360-degree control over that joint, but more you're preventing it from moving in a particular direction in order to finish the mechanic. So yeah, on screen, on camera, that may look quite ugly to someone who kind of has a particular model in their head of what that's supposed to look like, for sure.
So you talked about the order of operations earlier. Getting that tension in the joint, where does that fit in terms of your order of operations? If you're trying to isolate, say, an arm to set up some sort of attack or advancement, how important is tension compared to the other factors that you're looking for?
So to me, the order of operations also goes into kind of the order of importance. So for me, it's control is first, establishing control. You've talked about a number of times on various episodes about the 3-joint rule. That to me is kind of the essence of control. We have to get that in place first, and that is the most important. If we don't have that in place, the joint lock probably isn't going to happen at all. Second to me is putting the joint in traction. So I do as much of that as I can before I start the braking mechanics, with the hopes that the effort that I'm going to have to put in that last step, the actual braking mechanics, is my goal. And it's completely unattainable in some joint locks, but just as a goal of something I'm kind of constantly working towards getting closer to, is I want my braking mechanics to be kind of visually imperceptible. I put that joint under so much tension initially that basically any additional movement is going to put it to the point of breaking, so they're ready to tap out before I get too far down the road.
Got it. I prefer this approach as well, especially from topside positions where I have the luxury of being in a dominant position already. Then I can make sure I've got the tension I want before I proceed. I think this might be a little different if you're playing from the bottom, because it's harder to immobilize your opponent when you're the one on the bottom, even if you've got a really good guard. So I can understand why in those cases people might not want to take their time if they're trying to finish an armbar. They might be more focused on getting a sweep out of it so that then they have a stronger finishing position. But when you're the one on top, if you're finishing an armbar from mount or side control, it really pays off to spend a few seconds getting the tension that you want before you launch into that submission.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And again, this is kind of how my game has evolved. But even a lot of the joint locks that I attack while I'm on my back, although they are relatively rare, I tend to do the ones that allow me to go at a pace that's going to give me opportunities to take the slack out of the joints before I get too far down the road. I think about things like, I'm a big fan of things like the omoplata and the choi bar and some of those other where immobilization and traction are a lot more possible.
So here's something I want to pick your brain on. What does good tension feel like? You mentioned that it's hard to teach tension because it's kind of a feel thing. You can't just look at someone else's technique and always tell exactly how tight that is. Sometimes even with your own technique, it's hard to tell how much tension is there. The last time I was at a seminar, it was with Chris Wojcik, and he was showing a lot of variations of his ankle locks, and some of them felt really weird because it didn't feel like I had any tension at all. But my training partners insisted that no, this is really tight. So sometimes you can't even feel the tension yourself. I'm always looking for tells about this. How do you know when something has the right tension to proceed? Because it doesn't always feel the same and it's not always easy to teach.
No, I mean, a lot of the times I've gotten to the point where a lot of them, I can kind of feel them a little better, but I'm also looking for kind of visual indicators in them. Slight changes in posture, maybe a little wince here and there, so that even their ability to just move in certain ways, you're going to get pretty good indicators that you're getting things properly under tension. The other thing to think about is, as a kind of a rule of thumb, a lot of times the tension, the traction that we need to put the joints in, you can roughly estimate it by just pulling those limbs away from the body. When in doubt, that's probably a pretty good strategy. And then, there's lots of other little tips and tricks and things that are really contextual and dependent on which joint locks we're looking for. But when you think about an arm bar, a knee bar, ankle locks, that sort of thing, a lot of times just thinking about pulling the entire limb away from the torso, from the body, will get you far.
So this was a big realization for me. I first heard, I think it was Ryan Hall talking about this in the context of an open elbow. If you want to kimura someone, you pull that elbow away from their body. And I've realized that is almost always good advice in pretty much any position in jiu-jitsu. If you can get the limbs separate from the body, it makes them weaker and it makes them more vulnerable. Why is that? Why is it such a good universal concept in jiu-jitsu?
Well, I mean, I think certainly getting the arms, if your arms are down to your side and you're thinking about pulling them up and away, that may be slightly different than what I'm talking about, maybe, where I would think about, even aside from braking mechanics, if I'm wanting to put the arm under tension, if someone's laying on their back, maybe I put my feet on their rib cage and grab their wrist, and I start putting my body into extension. So I'm literally trying to lengthen or stretch their entire arm out, which obviously is a lot harder to do when their arms are by their side. Same thing, you talked about the shoulder locks, the kimura, the north-south kimura, the kind of mounted where you're sitting on their head. I really think about kind of getting into the crook of the elbow and pulling, almost trying to pull the shoulder out of its socket and getting it as tight as I can before those braking mechanics start. So I think our ability to add that kind of traction requires those arms to be kind of out and available to us to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, also, it just tends to put your body in a less athletic position. It's harder to use the strong muscles in your arms and legs when they're kind of isolated from your body or at awkward angles. And it also gives you, as the attacker, an effective handle. A lot of the things that your opponent would want to do, like rotate their body to get out of stuff, it's really hard to do that if the limbs are in traction and they can't move, if there's no give there. Going back to the hitchhiker escape, I have said before that a lot of late stage defenses in jiu-jitsu involve rotation. Usually you want to defend a position in a simpler way first. So if I'm arm barring you, you're probably going to want to try to stack me or free your elbow first. That's going to be the easiest way. But there is a late stage defense, which is to rotate your whole body so that the submission becomes irrelevant. And that would be, in this case, the hitchhiker. And a lot of other submissions have defenses like this. There is a way to roll out of a heel hook. There are some dicey and not great rolling defenses you can do for the Kimura, but you have to be careful because you run the risk of rolling into it deeper. The general pattern you'll see, though, is that the rolling defenses and rolling escapes are usually a good late stage defense. It's probably not the first thing that you're going to want to do because you have to take big movements with your body, which creates openings. And in many situations, you can expose your back or open yourself up to other attacks. So rotating out of something is usually not the first defense you want to use, but it is a valid defense. And if you take the tension out, then you take out the ability to rotate. And that's just one less thing as the attacker that you have to worry about. If your opponent cannot rotate their body, then that's one final late stage defense that they can't use to get out of your attack.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I probably think about the 3-joint rule maybe differently than some other folks. So when we're talking about things that attack, for instance, the Kimura, if we're dealing with a shoulder lock, I'm thinking about controlling the elbow and then, the joint or joints above it, which ends up being the spine. So I try very hard on many of these to, as part of that established control, that step one, try to control that so that their ability to rotate out of that stuff is diminished significantly.
You know what I don't see many people doing, which I think that we should all think more about, is when they attempt to move and they don't get the tension that they want, they just keep trying to finish the move. But I think sometimes it's smarter to reset and go back a step to get the tension that you want. So the example that I use, if I am mounted on you and I attempt to armbar you and I fall off to the side and I feel like, man, I just don't have this. Your elbow is a bit slippery. I feel like you're going to pop that out and come up on top. Or I feel like I can't get a good bite on your far shoulder. Many people will try to just finish from there. They'll try to tighten and get the position back or just kind of hope that maybe they can yank on the arm and do enough damage before the other person can escape. What I've started doing now is I will just hit Control Z and go back to the position I was in before. So I will get back up and kind of go back to a mount or an S mount or something like that. Make sure that the arms really are tense and tight and I've got that traction, and then I'll try to armbar again. And to your point earlier, what I find is if I have the armbar as tight as I want it to be, I can usually get the tap without even having to dismount. The person is usually tapping before my shoulders even hit the mat.
Yeah, I mean, people that have been on the mat a while should be able to recognize pretty quickly when you've got that level of control and that level of tension that you going back any further is really flirting with disaster. So I think that is an absolutely smart place to be tapping. And I think that's exactly right. I think leaving yourself room, space, opportunity, ability to move back a step is critically important with a lot of joint locks, so that if you aren't able or weren't able on the way there to get the tension that you needed or that you thought you had and you didn't quite have and got to go back and get more, being able to go back a step is super important.
Yeah, some positions allow you to do that. I mean, we talk a lot about re-rolling the omoplata, where if you don't quite get it, you can just roll again and set it up again. You can do similar things with a lot of different submissions, the armbar being one of them. If you are doing a topside armbar and it's not quite right, you're not obligated to sit there beside the person and fiddle with it until you get it or lose it. you can remount them. You can get back up and go to an S mount or a full mount, set it up again, and then arm bar them again. And for many topside positions, you have the benefit of doing that. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. So my advice is when you are going down that road of trying to finish a submission, don't get so myopic about, I have to finish it from here. Realize that it might be easier for you to go back to the controlling position you were in before, retighten it, and then try to finish again, rather than trying to finish from a somewhat loose, not ideal position.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's true in so much of jiu-jitsu, is leaving yourself opportunities to back up a step if things aren't going quite the way you had hoped. And, when we're talking about joint locks, so much of the way we talk about it, I'm not quite sure whether it's just kind of the way we talk about it or whether it's our actual mental model, not to put too fine a point on it, about what joint locks actually are. We talk so much about when we're doing joint locks, we're breaking this, we're breaking that. And I think it was our friend Chris Paynes, who I may have first heard him talk about it, was, really all we're doing is trying to cause bad sprains, right? We're not really trying to break bones per se. And when you really understand that we're really dealing with kind of ligaments and sometimes tendons, those ligaments are, have some flexibility to them, kind of like rubber bands. And when we take them to the point where we take a rubber band to a certain point and we keep pulling it, it will eventually break. So our joints aren't made of bones. And we have to remember that. So our ability to add kind of that stretch to it and getting it right to the point where that rubber band's getting ready to snap makes the work we have to do so minimal.
Yeah, I think that should always be the objective, is you want to try to make submissions easy. Yes, I know that when you see a live match, often it feels like a person is fighting like their life depends on it to get that submission, but it's going to be easier if you set the table properly so that you've got the tension before you go for the submission. You don't always have the luxury of doing that, but when you can, you should. And philosophically, this is kind of at odds with the way that I was taught coming up. I don't know if other people are like this, but no one ever told me that if you don't quite like the look of a position you're in, you can just back up and retry and start again, as long as you're not losing any position while you do it. I was always put under the impression that when you took a step forward, you had to keep going down that path, and it was a failure if you switched it up. And this led to me making a lot of mistakes, like holding on to mount even when there was no way I was going to keep it, and then I'd eventually lose it because I was too stubborn to dismount to side control or knee on belly, and so I would wind up just losing the whole thing. But I realize now that if you're in a dominant position, or at least a position that you can hold, if you're progressing forward and you don't quite like the way that it feels, it doesn't feel tight enough, you don't have the grips that you want, it's okay to take a second and even back up a bit, reset with the grips in the position you want, and then move forward again.
Yeah, I always joke and call this the kind of time travel problem of jiu-jitsu, is that we tend to spend too much time in the past and in the future rather than the current moment. And if you're spending time in that current moment, you're pretty quickly going to realize that whatever you're doing is not going to work. And so your ability to either move back and reset and try it again, or just move on from there, is once you're able to kind of start unlocking that ability and not getting stuck in the time travel, I think most people find that their game changes for the better. And in a lot of ways, at least for me, speaking personally, made jiu-jitsu a lot more fun. Being in the moment, being like, well, you know what? My guard's getting ready to get past. That's part of the game. I'm not going to spend the next 3 minutes or 3 seconds dwelling on it while whatever is being done to me is getting worse. I'm going to move forward with the current reality and go from there. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it is counter to the way a lot of us learned. It was so much, we don't give an inch, we don't give anything back, we don't ever move backwards. And I think those are two different things, right? Is you can still kind of back up a step and still maintain good control and good attack opportunity while still giving yourself the room and the space to fix whatever errors you made and then go back and execute it better.
Yeah, it's easy to get hung up on that quote about how you never move backward, always move forward. It takes a while to realize that's metaphorically. It doesn't mean you physically never move backward. Sometimes the best way to advance position is to move a little bit backward. That's very different from the philosophical idea of never give up an advantage that you've taken, making sure that you're always holding as many of the cards as you possibly can. Sometimes to get more of those cards and to get a better position, you need to physically move yourself backward or let something go and move on to something else.
That is absolutely right. It is a wisdom that I hope continues to spread, because I do really think that being able to embrace that idea really moves people's game forward for sure.
I'd love to give some more specific tactical examples of traction and tension in jiu-jitsu. Now, we talked about the arm bar. As a coach, what are some of the other places where you find yourself having to constantly correct or suggest to students that, hey, this is a place where you could possibly be applying more tension to get better results?
Ooh, everywhere. Say what you will about the submission, but I honestly think that one of the big problems and the reason the Americana gets so much hate is because people don't take the literal split seconds it takes to add the kind of requisite tension into it to quickly get a tap. The number of times I've seen people try to do Americanas or even Kimuras, and it literally seems like the person you're attacking's arm just continues to spin around 360s, and it all has to do with the fact that you just didn't have enough tension in it to begin with, and you're running out of runway, or you're just dealing with a hypermobile person. Taking that just extra second and adding a few little tweaks here and there. And, the Americana, it's probably won't make for good podcasting, kind of because the descriptions are going to feel a little esoteric. But, things like rolling your wrists in a particular way when you've got that Kimura grip will add tension, and pulling the elbows tighter. And there's all these little details that you can start adding in that will continue to stack that tension up, so that when it comes time to actually do the over rotation of the shoulder, you're barely moving it, if at all.
You can add me to Team Americana. I think the Americana is a much disparaged position. And although I understand why, I think one day someone's going to figure it out. You're going to see someone start to break out Americanas and get them in high-level competition. And then there's going to be an instructional, and the game's going to evolve, and we're all going to be doing Americanas. And I think that's a great example of where tension and traction matter. The Americana is a harder position to finish against a good person than some of the alternatives like a Kimura, just because it's a lot easier to do real damage with an internal rotation like a Kimura. The problem with the Americana is it's an external rotation. It's a rotation that, although it doesn't feel good, it's more natural for your body to do to a certain extent. And because of the way that the Americana is done, when you've got the person's back against the mat, again, you hit that limit. There is a physical surface preventing you from twisting and pulling that thing too far. And so when people try the Americana, what often happens is they don't quite have it tight enough, or, and maybe this is the bigger realization, they're not properly pinning the person's body in place. So the person can kind of rotate their body into the Americana to relieve the pressure. And you'll see this a lot where if I try to Americana you from, say, top side control, if you just sit there, I'll probably get it eventually. But if you just angle your body a bit towards the side so that you're kind of facing the arm that's being attacked, you're kind of turning a little bit away from me and towards the arm that's in jeopardy, it rotates that shoulder back into alignment just a little bit and takes away the tension.
Yeah, it takes the slack out.
Yeah, it's really hard to finish, especially against some people who just have freakishly flexible shoulders or frankly just don't care. But I've found that you can make the Americana way more successful by doing it from, say, a topside crucifix. If you're sitting on the near side arm while you Americana the far side arm, then the person can't do that. They can't rotate into the Americana to relieve the pressure. So it's in a perpetual state of tension, and it is a lot easier to finish. It's still harder to finish than a Kimura because you can't twist it as far back as you could a Kimura, but I do find that in most cases you will get the tap if you can lock a person into that position.
Well, I would even suggest, and I was getting ready to say the same thing, I am a avid frontside crucifix player. That is usually where I get most of my Americanas, because that near side arm is pinned and stapled under one of my legs, so they can't rotate in. And from that standpoint, I like the Americana when their backs are on the mat a little bit better, because the vast majority of the time, I don't need to lift their backs up off the mat to create space for rotation, because most of the time I'm able to add enough tension in there, and because the elbow's coming up and not having to go through the floor, that you're able to just keep them there and finish it. Whereas with the Kimura, not that it's not lovely. I mean, it really is a terrific even from that position, but the floor's in the way, and unless you can figure out how to make them kind of teleport through the floor, you're going to have to lift them up to make some space between them and the floor to get that rotation back the other way for the Kimura.
Yeah. This is also the reason why it is almost impossible to do a near side Americana. An Americana is almost always done on the far side. It's because if you attempt an Americana on the near side, which is like the arm next to you, it's really hard to keep your opponent pinned to the mat. They can just get up on their shoulder and turn to face you, and then it's really hard to get that finish. The only person I know who does that is, of course, the great legendary grappler CM Punk, who's one of his wrestling finishers is called the Anaconda Vice, which is a near side Americana. Basically, you put the person in Kesikatame, and then you try to Americana their near side arm. It's absolutely ludicrous. And it barely works. I think I did get someone with that one time who just had really tight shoulders and didn't want to go through this, but it basically won't work against a serious grappler because if you try to Americana their near side arm, there's no tension. They can just turn their whole body to face you and you're probably going to lose the whole thing. So just kind of explaining why the Americana is so maligned. A lot of it is the inability to hold tension in good positions. And with that move, again, you have a limit to how much you can twist because of the positioning of the floor. So in order to finish it, you have to have perfect tension or you just won't get it.
I'm thrilled that you brought up the old guys with the tight shoulders because it really is a perfect kind of natural manifestation of what we're talking about, right? Think about how much more quickly guys with bad shoulders or tight shoulders, and I say guys very specifically because it's usually them, they tap much quicker to these shoulder rotation based joint locks, and it is literally because of this tension issue. There's already so much tension in that joint and so little mobility that the level of effort that you have to put in to finish it is diminished incredibly.
Well, that's a really good point too, which is that tension can often be a body mechanics thing. It can be an attribute thing. Some people, just due to the tension of their joints, will experience greater levels of tension than others. I mean, we've all got that person in our gym who seems impossible to finish with an ankle lock or a shoulder lock because they're just so bendy. And then you've got other people who have so little mobility in those joints that they'll tap immediately. That is a really important observation when it comes to these types of finishes. They're not going to go the same for everybody. And that's another reason why control is so important. You've got to be real careful before you slam on an ankle lock or a shoulder lock, because there are some people who just have really tense joints. And I mean, you don't know if they've had surgery on them before. You don't know if they just have really bad flexibility or a degenerative condition. And it's tremendously important with joint locks like that you be very careful before you just rip on them, because you might find that one person you try it on, you can pull on it all day long and they don't even blink. And then other people you do that and they're in the hospital.
Yeah, the whole grip and rip mentality makes me incredibly uncomfortable. I've never been a big fan of it, and I don't really think that it has much of a place in recreational jiu-jitsu, which is frankly most jiu-jitsu players, I think, fall into that bucket. And for that reason, especially when you are doing things like what we're talking about, where we're through the act of getting the control, we're adding tension in and then just start gripping and ripping on it. It's quite dangerous, especially if they already have kind of a pre-existing injury or lack of mobility, that sort of thing. So I really, certainly for me and the folks that I train, I joke about it being in, matrix bullet time a lot of times. It's aspirational, obviously, but this idea that you've established control so well that you can finish these submissions looking like Neo in the Matrix in kind of slow motion, and there's nothing they can do about it. To me, it's a fun thing to work towards. It's much safer than the grip and rip mentality. And you don't have to worry so much about individual differences because you give people plenty of time to tap.
Yeah. I also want to get your feelings on leg entanglements and leg locks here, because this is another area where tension becomes so important. And it's actually one of the best ways to play this safely is by focusing on control and tension. When you hear horror stories of people getting badly injured with leg locks, it's often because they didn't properly have the position controlled. And because there was a degree of looseness, that gave the other guy an opportunity to try to backflip out of that heel hook. And that's when things went wrong. If you really have things tight and your wedges are primed and you've got the person locked down, they can't even do that, right? That's how a good leg lock works. You should have complete control over their body so that they simply cannot get out. And part of that is having tension in the right places. How does that all fit in? And how do you teach around making sure that you've got proper tension with leg locks? Like, what are you looking for there, especially when you teach beginners how to play these positions safely?
Wow, that's a great question. So, and multi-part. So let me think about how to pick this apart a little bit. First, it's always really important to me that people understand what body parts that they are actually attacking with a lot of these attacks. And then once they understand what body parts that they're, roughly attacking, sometimes it bleeds into other places, but like the heel hook attacking the knee. Okay, so we know we're attacking the knee. That's where we need to start taking the slack out. And then if we're attached to their leg and body with this particular kind of leg entanglement, these are the things that I can be doing with my body to introduce additional tension into that system before I get into breaking mechanics. And I certainly, from my vantage point, I feel like I've seen a real change in, take the heel hook, for instance. I feel like we're seeing so many more people now finish it through almost extension of their own body. They'll get their connection and they'll get the heel trapped really well. And then, maybe it's through hipping in or bridging back, that it's the actual tension there that ends up being the breaking mechanic, rather than taking the heel and turning it in a particular direction. And, the same thing we've had an absolute ankle lock renaissance in the last, 3 to 5 years. Certainly when you and I were coming up, and, you'll have to tell me your experience, but ankle locks back when we were coming up were kind of a joke. People just, oh, those aren't real. You can kind of ignore those. Not that I ever did, but I've known a lot of people over the years to just eat those things. And there were enough people spending enough time figuring out how to add tension in different directions and in using different methodologies that now people do have to respect them, and they're back in the game. Maybe we can expect the same for the Americanas at some point. But yeah, to answer your question, it really is just first and foremost having the people knowledgeable about what it is that they're attacking, and then helping them with strategies for adding that tension and or, new ways of setting up those particular attacks. I know I'm certainly not the only one using it, but for my ankle locks now, I very rarely go into any of the sort of standard, ashi leg entanglement configurations. And I'm now almost exclusively trying to use, most of the time I find myself using kind of a butterfly hook behind the knee, because that's actually where I create that tension as I start kind of pushing the back of the thigh so I can pull the lower leg out and away so that I can add a ton of tension into the ankle. And I'm not so concerned with the upper leg or the hips or the body. So I've really kind of isolated that lower leg. And, you're seeing that in the trend locks and the butterfly ashi and all the kind of ways that game's developed there. I think it is, a direct illustration of these concepts.
Yeah, it's hard to give specifics with leg entanglements because there are so many things that can happen. But if I were to give some very broad advice, that's almost always a good idea. You have to remember, what are the things that your opponent wants to do to prevent you from leg locking them, right? One of them is you want to take away their base. It's such a common defense that the person's going to try to base on the floor, and that allows them to build height, to get up, to put weight down on the foot, and then it's way harder to finish. A lot of the front level defenses that you'll see people use involve them trying to put weight on or get base with that foot. So if you can prevent the person from basing on the foot, that's going to help a lot. And that's why, if you're trying to heel hook someone, you've kind of got their heel twisted in a position where that's hard. But if you're ankle locking them, like one of the nice benefits of a position like the Aoki lock or the Woj lock is it's really hard for the person to base on their foot when it's twisted like that, when the only thing that they can touch onto the mat at best is their toes. That's very different from a classic straight ankle lock where I can push my foot right through and base against the mat, right? So if you can have the person's foot floating off the ground and they can't base easily on anything, that's one great defense. The other one, where it comes to tension, is rotation, right? And this is where concepts like double trouble come into play. If you control the far leg, then they can't rotate. Whereas if you're only controlling one leg, if there's any looseness at all, they can rotate and spin and get up. And although those are not always the best defenses, they are defenses, and they allow the other person to move and to change the position around and maybe even counterattack you. So how can you prevent them from doing that? Well, one of the obvious ways is you control the other leg, right? And then of course, in general, you just want to make sure that they cannot escape their leg. And that means you need some degree of tension on the leg. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Going back to the old days, like you talked about, yeah, I remember when I started, ankle locks were heavily disparaged. And I remember straight up being told by a senior belt that like ankle locks are a joke. And if you tap to one, you're not a serious grappler. And that is such bullshit.
If they could see us now.
Yeah, that is advice that did not age well, right? That would be like telling someone to put their life savings in NFTs. Didn't age well. So I think what we know now is there's a lot of ways that someone can put tremendous tension on the leg if they do it properly. And so if you've got good biting mechanics to prevent them from escaping the knee, or even if you do something like the short Achilles or the Caltera ankle lock, where instead of biting on the knee, you're like pushing down on the shin, you can still control the person's leg and get a ton of tension on it. So that is actually one thing that has changed with a lot of I'd say the more recent evolutions of the ankle lock. If you take a look back at the like standard Ashy position, the kind of like, I guess you could call it like some people call it single leg X guard, but I don't really like to talk about that because it's more of a leg entanglement. But person's butt is on the ground, you're in standard Ashy, you've wrapped your body around their leg and you're pinching together. That kind of classic standard Ashy position on the leg, it could be good for control, but there's not a lot of tension on the leg itself. And that's, I think, why it gets maligned as being a bad finishing position.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It is pretty decent for control, but I mean, that's why there are so many other Ashy variations out there and so many other different entanglements and ways to control and add that tension, is because that kind of the standard wasn't serving its purpose particularly well in that regard anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a good heuristic that you can use to decide if you've got control in a leg entanglement position. One of the factors is, do you have sufficient tension that you can actually keep it there? If you don't have enough of a pinch, or if the person can slip their leg or move it around, or you're not locking their knee in place, it's going to be easier for them to fight off what you're doing and escape.
Yeah, that's right. And not to get too in the weeds, but a lot of times I will find myself in that standard Ashi, and one of the knowing how people generally defend that is they take that kind of outside leg where their heel's hooked into the hip and start moving that off of their hip. Them doing that then, kind of creates that opportunity then to move to something like the butterfly Ashi, where I can get that butterfly hook behind the knee and then send the other leg over to the hip and start getting the tension that I need. So that's a really, I guess, a long way of saying, a lot of those positions, even though they may not be the terminal position, they definitely have some utility of helping you kind of get where you need to go eventually. So I don't think they are to be discarded completely, for sure.
Any good resources or suggestions you have, Jesse, for people who might feel like their game is a bit too loose? Is this something that there's a resource out there to help people troubleshoot?
Oof. I don't know. Maybe we need to create one. Honestly, I don't know of any sort of single source. There are certain folks that talk about it in certain contexts. I mentioned him earlier. I don't know if you ever heard his spiel on it, but this is why Chris Payne's a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think he was relatively serious about not doing submissions at his gym anymore. And it was because they were, as a goal of the school itself, trying to get to a point where their control and their tension was so high before any breaking mechanics or choking mechanics started, that to go any further would cause damage. So, certainly it's something he has talked about a lot. I don't know that he necessarily has any kind of breakdown resources. So no, not that I'm aware of, but I think spending time on your individual game and looking at kind of the joint locks that whether you're able to finish them or not in the moment, in the current state of your game, I think looking at those joint locks in isolation as you use them and as you find them and start playing with and looking at different ways to add tension, I think could be really valuable. And again, that requires a certain pace and a slowness and, maybe even some dry work of, hey, if I turn it this way, what happens? And, getting some feedback from a partner during open mat, right? I don't know that it's necessarily something that you're going to be able to figure out in a live role. Sorry to all the CLA folks, but I do think that there is some kind of self-experimentation that folks can go through to figure some of this stuff out on their own. Certainly it's how I've had to figure out a great deal of it.
I'm not sure if this is covered there, but people could check out BJJ Concepts. Rob Bernacki has talked a lot about tension, and although I don't know for sure, if you go through his material, he might have some good conceptual framings around this. Another person who talks about it quite a bit, we've been featuring her a lot recently, is Beatrice Jin. One of the things that she always says is, if you can't hold it, you don't have it. I think that's a great mantra for focusing on positional control. A big part of that is tension. And so as a training goal, you can set a game for yourself where instead of trying to finish people, you just try to hold the position to your heart's content. See how long you can hold it there. Ideally, you should be able to hold it indefinitely. And a big part of that is creating tension. I mean, if you listen to me prattle on before and you've heard me talk about wedges and stuff, the reason you use these is because they hold people in place. They create that tension that makes it difficult for a person to escape because there's no space for them to do it. So that's a good game. If you can play a game where you hold a position or a semi-submission position, like you're kind of almost in an arm bar, but you don't finish. You just sort of hold it there for as long as you can. Even the setup and not the arm bar itself. Like you're going for an arm bar. Maybe you're mounted on top of someone and you've kind of got that arm isolated. Can you hold that for as long as you want? Because if you can, that means you probably have enough tension. If the person is able to get their arm free, that means that at some point you were too loose and they were able to pull it out.
Yeah, I mean, I use the same structure around some of the games that I design, especially when we're talking about this tension stuff. I don't necessarily go into holding it indefinitely, but when I'm setting up a game and I said, if you get to this point, you've got to hold it for 3 seconds before you can even start the breaking mechanics. And if they're able to get out in the 3 seconds, you don't need to worry about the breaking mechanics. You need to go back to getting better at the control. I think that's absolutely right.
I really like that. I never thought to do that, but it reminds me of the 3-second position rule. You have to hold a position for 3 seconds before you can count it. That's a great idea for submission practice as well. You have to be able to hold that for 3 seconds before you are allowed to apply any sort of finishing attempt. That's a really great game.
That is exactly where I stole the idea from.
Well, Jesse, tying this up, I always want to make sure that we get a chance to plug you and your stuff. But before we do, any closing thoughts? I mean, this is your topic, so if there's anything we didn't get to here, I want to make sure you have a chance to talk about it.
No, I mean, I think we covered the vast majority of it. Maybe the only other thing that I will add, a lot of this stuff for me was driven by the fact that at certain points during the gym's growth and history, we've had a ton of hypermobile people at the gym that were incredibly difficult to joint lock. And this was kind of my approach to figuring out how to do that with them without taking them to a point where it was making me want to barf, seeing their joints do things that shouldn't, it doesn't look like it should do in the textbooks. So just being able to have that ability and have that opportunity to figure out how to add that tension in will really fix if you've got that super hypermobile person in the gym. Usually there's going to be a way to be able to add that tension in, without their elbow looking like it's bending backwards before you're able to get the tap. It's something I tell the hypermobile folks at my gym, just because they're not feeling it or because their joints moving past a point where I think it should safely, there's still a lot of damage that can happen in the muscles and tendons. So even from a safety standpoint, even though it may seem a little counterintuitive, adding more of that tension in and making sure you're dumping that energy into the joint rather than the surrounding tissues, I think is a worthwhile and good goal.
I would add too, if you are one of those hyper flexible people, don't run around and brag about it or act like it's some superpower for a few reasons.
It's not.
Yeah. First of all, it's not. It's never a good situation to be the person who's really good at getting beat up. Like that's not a brag. Like, hey, I can go and get my ass kicked all the time and survive. And that's not a great thing. If you're always getting caught in these leg locks or submissions or whatever, rather than bragging about how your ankles are so flexible, figure out how to get out. Because I'll tell you, like eventually, no matter how hypermobile you are, you will eventually find that one person who's able to get it on you. And if you've spent your entire jiu-jitsu career thinking that you're invulnerable to these techniques, you probably won't be in a state of mind to tap fast enough when it does finally happen to you. No one is so hyper flexible that they have no breaking point. It just means you haven't found it yet. And so please, if you are hyper flexible, don't act like it's a superpower. Don't let people rip Kimuras on you as hard as they want or as long as they want. You will regret that decision at some point. So make sure you train like a normal person, even if you're abnormally flexible.
And after all, aren't we all a little abnormal?
Oh, I mean, If you're training jiu-jitsu for any length of time, you are to some degree abnormal. People often ask, well, why are there so many weirdos in jiu-jitsu? And I'm thinking, like, have you seen the criteria required to get in the door here? You have to be willing to, as a hobby, let strangers beat you up and choke you unconscious and risk breaking your bones. So already we've set a filter to ensure that you've got to be a bit unhinged to even walk in the door. That's why so many crazy people train jiu-jitsu. Well, if people want to train at a semi-normal gym, Jesse, if they are in Louisville, Kentucky, and want to train with the friendliest gym in town, where can they find you?
Yeah, so Rough Hands BJJ in Louisville, Kentucky, and roughhandsbjj.com and Rough Hands BJJ on all the socials. Come visit us. We get tons of visitors. We love having everybody. And if you're ever wanting to talk shop or, talking about joint tension and certain approaches to things, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking to folks, and especially when they're having success with some of this stuff.
Fantastic. I will put links in the show notes. And yeah, if anyone has the ability to train with Jesse, I highly recommend dropping in at Rough Hands. I mean, we've collaborated with Jesse a ton of times. I think that your approach is just fantastic, especially in terms of how you talk about the culture of a jiu-jitsu gym. For those who don't know, we actually made a whole course with Jesse on this. If you are a gym owner or aspiring gym owner and you rightfully understand the importance of culture and you want to hear some of that, just shoot me a message. I'll comp people a free copy of that course if they want to check it out. It's really good stuff if you want to think about the philosophy of how to build a solid jiu-jitsu gym that retains people over time and becomes a good place for people to hang out. So I will throw those links in the show notes as well to your stuff, Jesse. I will also link to our stuff. It is all at bjjmentalmodels.com. We've got tons of episodes of the podcast, getting dangerously close to episode 400. Tons of mini episodes if you want to get to the point quicker and you just want to have quick hits, just concepts quickly explained to you in just a few minutes. Our newsletter is over 15,000 strong and it's completely free, so get that too. And this is where I always tell people, please consider joining BJJ Mental Models Premium if you haven't already. We are over 700 subscribers now, which I think actually makes it one of the bigger subscription sites in all of Jiu-Jitsu Online, which is pretty cool. But we're very different. Our focus, although we do have video stuff, we prefer the written word. We prefer community and real relationships. So if you want audible or masterclass style presentation of content delivered as concepts, as philosophy through audio, that's what we are best known for. But also we have an amazing community that you really should be a part of. That's, I think, one of the bigger perks of being here. We can provide a bunch of additional support in the form of direct coaching. We've got an amazing black belt team that provide great feedback, and even business and marketing support. If that's a weakness in your portfolio and you need help with that, we can provide that too. But all of that is at bjjmentalmodels.com. I will link to that in the show notes, as well as your stuff, Jesse. But as always, thank you, my friend, for coming by. Great chat. I love nerding out on a physics concept like this. It always makes for a good chat.
Yeah, this was a blast. I appreciate you having me on. And to your listeners, BJJ Mental Models Premium is about the best money you can spend other than your gym membership. So I highly recommend it.
Oh, thanks, buddy. And tick spray, of course. That's also money well spent.
Yes, tick spray, of course. Yes.
Yeah, watch out for the ticks. All right. Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it. And thanks to the listeners as well. We will talk to you next week. See you then.